I found out that my privileges were suspended from a text message from a reporter.
Wow.
Okay.
Just imagine getting news like that. You're a doctor and you found out your career's been hit hard from a text. Not the hospital, not an email, a reporter.
That quote, it's from Dr. Mary Talley Bowden, and it really just throws you right into the middle of the intense conflict we're digging into today. We're looking at her story, her experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic as a kind of case study. Our mission here is to really try and unpack this clash, independent doctor thinking versus big institutional systems, all during a massive public health crisis. And what that did to public trust, it really frames it as a sort of, well, a David versus Goliath situation, doesn't it? With incredibly high stakes health, freedom, maybe even the future of how medicine is practiced?
It absolutely does. That quote alone tells you so much about the environment she was in. It wasn't just a disagreement. It felt adversarial, almost like a public takedown rather than, a standard professional review process.
Yeah.
And that really sets the stage for understanding the kind of pressure independent doctors might have faced if they stepped outside the lines of the emerging official story during the crisis.
Exactly. So, with that intense image in mind, let's focus on Dr. Bowden herself. Who was she before all this blew up? She wasn't some kind of known contrarian or activist. The source material paints her as a pretty straightforward ear, nose, and throat doctor, an ENT. She had her own private practice, Breathe MD, in Houston. And this is key. She wasn't tied to any big hospital systems, not the Mayo Clinic, none of that. Completely independent. She even called herself just your neighborhood ENT doctor.
Like just doing her job.
Yeah. And her path to getting there is interesting, too. Trained at Stanford, so, top credentials. Worked in private practice in Texas for 7 or 8 years. But then she took a big break, 7 years off to raise her kids. She even said she wasn't totally sure she'd go back to medicine.
Wow. 7 years is a long time away from practice.
It is. But she said she felt that itch that needed to be scratched, so she came back. And the timing is just, well, almost unbelievable. She opened her new solo practice, Breathe MD, in December 2019.
December 2019.
Yep. Literally 6 months before COVID turned the world upside down.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place, depending on how you look at it. She landed right in the thick of it.
That timing and her practice setup are absolutely critical to understanding everything that followed. Her being third-party free is a really significant factor here. Her clinic, Breathe MD, made it clear their mission was, and I'm quoting loosely here, patients over politics and, crucially, no financial ties to hospitals, insurance companies, or the government. They work only for their patients.
That sounds good, but what does it practically mean?
Well, it means autonomy. Most doctors today work for big health systems or have contracts with insurance companies that can, subtly or not so subtly influence how they practice, what treatments they favor, which protocols they have to follow. Dr. Bowden didn't have those constraints. She could, in theory, make decisions based purely on her clinical judgment and what she saw in front of her with her patients. That independence allowed her to try different things, to deviate from the emerging, very rigid hospital protocols. But that very independence, that freedom, is also what put her on a collision course with those institutions.
So her strength was also her vulnerability, in a way.
Exactly. It made her an outlier from the start.
Okay, so that makes sense why she could operate differently. So when COVID first started hitting, what did she actually do? Her initial approach sounds pretty, well, logical. Common sense, as she put it. She saw patients with these really persistent respiratory infections, not just a simple cold, so she treated the symptoms. Breathing treatments, antibiotics if she suspected a secondary bacterial thing, steroids for inflammation, basic respiratory care.
Standard tools for those kinds of symptoms.
Right. And she reported a lot of success early on with these methods. Patients were getting better. Then came the testing issue. Remember how impossible it was to get a quick COVID test early on? LabCorp, Quest, they were swamped, 2-week waits sometimes.
Yeah, it was chaos, made tracking impossible.
Well, Dr. Bowden already had a relationship with a smaller lab, Microgen DX, that she used for sinus infection testing. They jumped on developing a COVID test, a saliva test, with next-day results.
Next day, that was huge back then.
Huge. And her clinic was in a strip mall, easy access, drive-up testing. So, as she put it, her practice just exploded. People were desperate for fast, reliable tests.
So she suddenly became a major testing hub.
Pretty much overnight. And with all these patients coming through, she started tracking the data, not just positive or negative, but vaccination status too, once the vaccines rolled out. And this is where things really started to shift for her. She began noticing in her own patient group that the vaccine wasn't working, quite like the public narrative suggested.
You,
Meaning vaccinated people were still getting COVID, sometimes with significant symptoms. Her direct clinical observations started clashing with the official messaging about vaccine efficacy. And she says that observation, just tracking her own data, is sort of what got me in trouble. That discrepancy lit the fuse.
and again, because she was independent, she wasn't required to ignore that data or spin it. She could just see it. That third-party free status, combined with her own data collection, really set her apart. No financial ties, no institutional pressure to conform to a specific message, at least initially. It let her follow her clinical judgment and the evidence she was gathering herself, which, as we said, put her directly in conflict with the systems demanding uniformity. Her independence made her a target because she couldn't be easily controlled.
Right, she was outside the usual levers of control. Okay, so that independence leads us straight into the next big area, the battle over early treatments. As things developed, her approach evolved. She started using monoclonal antibodies. These were authorized early on, seen as effective as given soon after infection.
Yes, they got an Emergency Use Authorization and EUA.
Right. But according to the source, her clinic became known because she didn't ration them. Apparently elsewhere, there were restrictions, maybe based on race or age, limiting who could get them. She just gave them to eligible patients who needed them.
So open access based on clinical need.
That's what it sounds as. Until, as she put it, the final straw. The government supply got restricted, especially, she says, for patients once they were admitted to the hospital. She told a story about a friend's friend who qualified for them, but once he crossed the hospital threshold, boom, denied. Couldn't get them anymore.
That seems counterintuitive if they were effective.
She thought so too, and that restriction, she felt, was dangerous and left patients stranded. It pushed her to seriously look for alternatives, and that led her straight to ivermectin.
The drug that became incredibly controversial.
Hugely. So, faced with limited options, she started researching it, specifically its safety. She went to the FDA's own website, looked up the toxicity data, the LD50. Now, LD50, maybe we should clarify that.
Sure. LD50 stands for lethal dose 50. It's a standard measure in toxicology. It's the dose of a substance that would kill 50%, half, of a test population of animals. So a lower LD50 means something is more toxic.
Okay, so she looked up ivermectin's LD50. It's between 10 and 80 milligrams per kilogram. The dose she was considering for COVID was tiny in comparison, around 0.4 milligrams per kilogram.
So a massive difference, orders of magnitude.
Exactly. Based on that FDA data, she concluded the safety concerns at therapeutic doses were just not supported. The safety margin looked enormous.
Which makes the public narrative around it being inherently dangerous, the whole horse dewormer thing, seem disconnected from this basic toxicity data. It raises questions about why that context wasn't more widely shared. And ivermectin wasn't some new weird drug. It's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It won a Nobel Prize in 2015 for treating horrible parasitic diseases like river blindness, saved millions of lives globally.
Nobel Prize? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, huge impact. And there was research, in vitro studies, meaning in test tubes, not people showing it could stop the SARS-CoV-2 virus from replicating. Now, in vitro doesn't automatically mean it works in humans, not at all. But normally, that kind of signal, combined with a known safety profile, would lead to more research, open discussion, not immediate condemnation and ridicule.
You'd think so. She also said she searched medical literature for reports of serious harm or death from ivermectin overdoses and found, quote, not a single study. Compared that to thousands for Tylenol overdoses.
Right, Tylenol overdose is a well-known cause of liver failure.
And it's still relevant today, apparently. The source mentions even in 2025, people like Chris Cuomo were reportedly using ivermectin for long COVID, so it hasn't entirely vanished despite the controversy.
Interesting. So persists underground, maybe?
Seems like it. Because getting it became incredibly difficult. Patients couldn't get prescriptions filled easily. This led people to desperate measures. The source says people were getting it from feed stores. The animal version, or trying to buy it from India or Mexico. Dr. Bowden did a Twitter poll, and 52% of the people who responded said they got ivermectin from a feed store.
Wow. That highlights a massive breakdown in access, forcing people towards unregulated, potentially unsafe sources.
Exactly. Dr. Bowden argued the FDA should have just made it over-the-counter, like in some other countries, to ensure people got the right product and dosage. And it wasn't just her thinking that. Apparently, 17 states tried to pass bills to make it OTC, and 3 Tennessee, Idaho, Arkansas actually succeeded. Shows a real pushback at the state level.
Okay, so this whole situation, the monoclonal restrictions, the push towards ivermectin, the difficulty accessing it, brings us to that systems analysis you mentioned earlier, the alleged strategic and financial context. Let's talk about the Emergency Use Authorization, the EUA again. As we said, it's a fast-track pathway for getting medical products used in emergencies. But the allegation raised in the source material is quite specific. For a vaccine to get an EUA, there couldn't be any other recognized effective treatments available.
Wait, really? That's a rule?
That's the allegation that this condition created a powerful, almost systemic incentive not to find or approve other treatments. If something like ivermectin or even monoclonals were officially deemed effective, it could potentially block the vaccine EUA.
So the system designed to speed things up might have actually slowed down or stopped other options.
That's the claim. It frames the suppression of early treatments, including stopping monoclonals for hospital patients, not just as clinical decisions, but potentially as strategic ones tied to clearing the path for vaccines.
That's a pretty explosive allegation.
It is. And then you layer on the financial side. The vaccine manufacturers were granted indemnity,
Meaning?
meaning essentially they have complete immunity from financial liability if something goes wrong with the vaccine. If someone claims they were harmed, they generally can't sue the company. The risk is shifted largely to the government or ultimately the public purse.
That's unusual for medical products, isn't it?
Highly unusual for most drugs. And there are also claims the very definition of vaccine was tweaked to make sure the new mRNA tech fit under this protective umbrella. So you have this combination. Alleged pressure to suppress alternatives because of the EUA rule, plus massive financial incentives and immunity for the vaccines. The source argues this created an environment where profit and policy alignment could potentially overshadow pure patient well-being or open scientific exploration, especially if institutions felt, ideologically or financially captured.
That's a complex web of potential influences, and it wasn't just Dr. Bowden feeling this pressure, right? The source mentioned others.
Absolutely. Dr. Robert Malone, for instance, he's credited as a co-inventor of the mRNA technology itself, holds patents.
You'd think his voice would carry weight.
You would. But he reportedly had a severe adverse reaction himself, spoke out about concerns, and was apparently quickly labeled a kook and discredited.
Wow, okay. And Dr. Peter McCullough.
Yeah, described as maybe the most published physician in his field ever. Huge research output. But when he apparently took a moral and ethical stand against the protocols and pushed for early treatment, his career was allegedly targeted, basically dismantled.
So even highly credentialed experts face backlash if they dissented.
Exactly. It sends a powerful message throughout the medical field. This idea of financial capture suggests institutions might prioritize things that align with funding or regulatory favor, maybe suppressing things that don't fit. It's not always about conscious evil plans, but systemic incentives. If the main path forward is seen as mass vaccination, anything that complicates that narrative, even if it has clinical merit for individuals, might get pushed aside. It really challenges the idea of purely independent medical policy.
Okay, that provides some crucial context for the pressures involved. Let's shift now to segment 3, Anatomy of an Information Campaign. Because the pushback wasn't just institutional, it was very public. Dr. Bowden and ivermectin itself faced this huge media and institutional attack. We have to talk about that FDA tweet.
Oh, the "you're not a horse" tweet.
Yeah, seriously, y'all, you're not a horse, you're not a cow, stop it. Simple, maybe even funny to some, but the source says it had dire consequences. It just stuck. It became the dominant narrative, repeated constantly. Branding ivermectin as horse dewormer made using it seem ridiculous, dangerous, stupid even. Ridicule as a weapon.
A very effective weapon in public discourse.
And apparently it went beyond just words. Dr. Bowden claims CNN actually altered her appearance in a broadcast. Changed her face to look slightly green, made her hair look wild, specifically to make her look like a maniac.
Visual manipulation, that's a serious claim.
Very serious. And then there was a Rolling Stone article. It allegedly used a stock photo from Oklahoma, completely unrelated, showing gunshot victims waiting in line at a hospital.
What? Why?
The article allegedly presented this image as if it showed hospitals overwhelmed by people who'd taken ivermectin, a total fabrication linking the drug visually to chaos and harm that wasn't real. Just brazen, as the source put it.
That's beyond misleading. That's creating a false reality.
And the horse dewormer label just wouldn't die. Even years later, 2025, a Vanity Fair reporter apparently still used the term. Shows how sticky that initial branding was.
It absolutely sounds like a case study in information warfare, using ridicule the horse tweet,
Hmm.
using branding horse dewormer, visual distortion, the alleged CNN incident, false association, the Rolling Stone photo. These are all tactics designed to discredit not just the drug, but anyone associated with it, doctors prescribing it, patients asking for it, make them seem foolish or dangerous, control the narrative, control perception.
And the attacks came from inside the medical establishment too, right? Houston Methodist Hospital.
Yeah, a big prestigious hospital in Houston, described as the elite. Very proud of being the first in the country to mandate the vaccine for staff.
They went after Dr. Bowden publicly. Yes,
Right,
they
yeah.
tweeted about her, criticizing her. Then they suspended her hospital privileges, which is a huge deal for a doctor's ability to practice fully. And that's when she got the text from the reporter.
Right, found out through the media, not the hospital itself. Then the hospital apparently worked with CNN and the Washington Post to publicize her suspension, making an example of her, basically.
The personal toll must have been immense. She described it as devastating. Spending a weekend in the fetal position, crying, angry, feeling pissed, said she was scared to go to the grocery store, felt self-conscious at her kids' school events, just completely exposed and attacked.
It's hard to imagine that level of public and professional pressure. And this connects to something called the Strand effect, apparently named after another doctor who went through something similar. Houston Methodist's attack, while maybe meant to silence her, actually made her story much bigger. It backfired in that sense, gave her a platform.
Right.
But it also worked in another way. It absolutely silenced other doctors. Seeing what happened to her public shaming, loss of privileges made others terrified of speaking out. So even if they had similar observations or concerns, they kept quiet. The fear of professional destruction created conformity. It's a powerful deterrent.
So it amplified her voice but quieted many others.
Precisely. And the pressure wasn't just hospitals. It came from regulatory bodies, too. The Federation of State Medical Boards, it's a private group, but it influences all the state boards. In fall 2021, right when vaccine mandates were rolling out, they sent out a directive. It was about ivermectin, about misinformation. Essentially, it encouraged state boards to investigate and discipline doctors prescribing it or questioning the narrative.
So a top-down push for enforcement.
Seems like it. And Dr. Bowden is still dealing with the Texas Medical Board years later, trying to clear her name.
And the source emphasized something important about those complaints, didn't it?
Yes, critically. While the complaints were mostly about ivermectin, they consistently noted no patient harm, no evidence she'd actually hurt anyone.
So they were going after her for
And what?
just disagreeing, using an approved drug off-label.
That's the implication, that the disciplinary focus wasn't on patient safety outcomes, but on adherence to protocol and narrative. It raises serious questions about whether the system was prioritizing conformity over clinical judgment, even when patients weren't being harmed.
That's a really troubling aspect. And she had other legal fights too, right? The hospital case in Dallas.
Yes, with Texas Hugley Hospital. It involved a sheriff's deputy who was dying of COVID. His wife desperately wanted him to be able to try ivermectin. Dr. Bowden agreed to prescribe it. They actually went to court and won. Got a court order mandating the hospital give Dr. Bowden temporary privileges so she could administer the drug.
A court order. So she treated him.
No. This is where it gets even more astonishing. Despite the direct court order, the hospital apparently engaged in stall tactics,
Like what?
like demanding an insane amount of paperwork in less than 24 hours.
Yeah.
3-year surgical case log, 3 letters of recommendation, a 30-page application, things that normally take weeks, especially during a pandemic when rules were often streamlined,
Impossible deadlines.
basically.
Mm.
She managed to submit it all, somehow, and they still denied her privileges, directly defying the spirit, if not the letter, of the court order preventing the treatment.
That's just...
The source connects this kind of resistance, this institutional stonewalling, to a broader context, what it calls a masterful job of propaganda over the years that the pharmaceutical drug companies have done. The argument is that decades of marketing, lobbying, and influence have shaped public perception and medical thinking, making it hard for alternative or non-patentable approaches to get traction, especially when they conflict with profitable, newer products. A deep-seated bias in the system.
Okay, let's take a quick pause there. We'll be right back to talk about the aftermath claims of injuries, institutional denial, and where things stand now. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're discussing the case of Dr. Mary Talley Bowden. We've covered her background, her early treatment approaches, and the intense information campaign against her. Now let's look at the aftermath. Segment 4, Institutional Denial and Patient Injury. This part deals with some very difficult and controversial claims presented in the source material. Dr. Bowden reports she is still seeing patients years later with what she identifies as vaccine injuries, as many as 6 new vaccine-injured patients every week.
6 a week. That's a significant number for one solo practice.
It is. She describes their conditions as very challenging, complex, multi-system problems, and says treating them, sometimes using ivermectin, is slow going, taking months. She also raises a really controversial idea that what's often called long COVID might actually be, in many cases, related to vaccine injury.
How so?
Her observation is that unvaccinated people in her practice didn't seem to get long COVID with the same types of symptoms as some vaccinated people who developed persistent issues after infection or vaccination. It's her clinical observation suggesting a potential link or overlap that needs investigation.
That's a huge claim, obviously, challenging the standard understanding.
Definitely. One specific injury discussed is myocarditis, heart muscle inflammation, especially concerning in young people. He points out it's hard to diagnose definitively without invasive tests like a heart biopsy or a cardiac MRI, which she says most kids are not going to be put through.
Right, those aren't minor procedures.
So the implication is that the true rate might be undercounted because milder or subclinical cases aren't getting formally diagnosed. The official numbers might not capture the full picture.
This leads directly to the issue of alleged systemic denial. If these injuries are happening, is the system acknowledging them? The source points to the CICP, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program.
That's the official government program for vaccine injury compensation, right?
Correct. It's supposed to be the safety net. But the source paints a picture of profound failure. It cites a 98% denial rate.
98%.
That's the figure given. Out of everyone who applied, allegedly, only 30 people got any compensation. And the average payout was tiny, like $4,000.
That sounds completely inadequate if people have serious, life-altering injuries.
It leaves people feeling completely abandoned, dismissed. Imagine suffering a debilitating condition you believe is linked to a mandated countermeasure, and the official compensation system denies almost everyone. The impact on trust is devastating.
And there's another layer to this denial, isn't there? The coding issue.
Yes, this is crucial from a systems perspective. ICD-10 codes the International Classification of Diseases. They're the numerical codes doctors use for everything: diagnoses, billing, tracking statistics, essential for public health data.
Okay, so what's the issue?
The source states there is no specific ICD-10 code for vaccine injury. There's apparently a code for vaccine hesitancy, someone's attitude, but not for the injury itself.
Wait, you can code someone for being hesitant, but not for being injured?
That's the claim. And it means these injuries are effectively invisible in the official data. You can't track them systematically, you can't study their prevalence easily. It makes getting compensation even harder.
They literally don't count in the system.
Exactly. This lack of a code structurally reinforces the denial. If you can't code it, it statistically doesn't exist on a large scale.
That's quite something. The source also included even more disturbing claims about what was happening inside hospitals during the peaks, allegations of patients being essentially euthanized, claims that doctors, may be overwhelmed or thinking patients were doomed anyway, pushed drugs like morphine and insulin, primarily because they needed the bed.
Those are incredibly serious allegations about end-of-life care decisions under pressure.
Extremely. There's a specific anecdote about a patient with zero pain who died minutes after getting morphine and insulin pushes. The source even compares it to a doctor investigated after Hurricane Katrina for similar actions. It paints a picture of potential ethical breakdowns under extreme system stress.
A horrifying thought.
And this connects, maybe surprisingly, to Canada's MAID program, Medical Assistance in Dying. The source notes over 15,000 people used it in Canada in 2023. And eligibility there has expanded beyond terminal illness to things like depression or even just being overweight, according to the source.
That's a controversial expansion, definitely.
But the really jarring claim is that some people identified as vaccine injured, feeling dismissed or without hope in their own countries, have reportedly gone to Canada or Switzerland specifically to seek assisted dying.
Good grief. That suggests a level of despair and perceived abandonment that's hard to fathom. If people feel their suffering is so unacknowledged, they seek MAID elsewhere. That's a profound indictment.
It really is.
And all of this, the alleged denial of injuries by CICP, the missing ICD code, these harrowing hospital claims, the MAID connection, it all feeds into what the source describes as a deep, maybe permanent erosion of public trust in the medical establishment. When people feel the system isn't listening, isn't acknowledging their suffering, maybe even actively denying it, that trust evaporates. Dr. Bowden's quote sums it up. They've destroyed our profession. People don't trust doctors anymore. People are scared to go to the hospital.
If that fear becomes widespread, the implications for future health crises or even just routine healthcare are massive.
Immense. And the Brooke Jackson whistleblower case adds another layer. She sued Pfizer, claiming that as a director for their research clinics, she saw them skipping necessary steps and, crucially, not following up with injuries reported during the vaccine trials.
So, alleging problems with the original research data itself.
Yes, and she was fired after reporting it. Even more concerning is the claim that the Department of Justice is allegedly trying to get her case dismissed, supposedly because it could impact public health policies.
Meaning potentially damage public confidence if the allegations were proven.
That's the implication. It suggests, again, a potential prioritization of protecting the program or the company over investigating potential wrongdoing or safety issues. It fuels that public skepticism about transparency and accountability.
The source even broadens this critique beyond COVID, suggesting a general trend of questioning established medical practices, maybe sometimes without good reason. It mentions an alleged AMA report calling things like ear tubes and tonsillectomies proven harmful and unnecessary.
Which seems odd given their long history of helping kids with chronic ear infections or breathing problems.
Exactly. Ear tubes help hearing, prevent infections. Tonsillectomies can resolve sleep apnea, chronic tonsillitis. The source seems to worry that this skepticism, maybe fueled by the same propaganda and financial capture issues, leads to woeful ignorance even among doctors about basic health realities or the benefits of older, proven treatments versus newer, potentially less effective ones.
It speaks to that idea of breeding conformity. The source mentions a statistic: 33% of drugs approved over 10 years got significant new safety warnings within just 4 years.
A third of them, that's high.
It is. And apparently, many doctors aren't even aware of that general risk level. The argument is the training emphasizes following guidelines, being rule followers, not necessarily deep, independent, critical thinking about every intervention. And that conformity, that lack of questioning, became, as the source put it, a big problem during the pandemic. It hampered the ability to adapt or challenge the dominant approach, unlike what Dr. Bowden tried to do.
A very sobering analysis of the potential systemic weaknesses. Okay, let's move to our final segment. The briefing summary, key reconnaissance points. So after all this, where does Dr. Bowden stand now? Well, the fight isn't over. She's still tangled up with the medical board, trying to clear my name, still involved in legal battles. It's ongoing. But personally, the experience seems to have transformed her. She says she used to be very shy, hated public speaking. Now she feels she can do things now that I never thought I could do. Forged in the fire, perhaps?
Adversity revealing hidden strengths.
Seems like it. And despite everything, she feels vindicated finally. Says she's not embarrassed to go to the school functions anymore. People in her community approach her now, saying nice things.
So a shift in local perception, maybe.
Yeah, it reflects that idea Joe Rogan mentioned about people getting red-pilled, waking up to what they perceive was really happening during the pandemic, maybe seeing her struggle differently now.
A change in perspective as more information comes out or narratives shift.
Right. And she also briefly touched on other mainstream advice she questions, like the flu shot. Cites a Cleveland Clinic study suggesting it might increase risk for other respiratory illnesses, claims it's never been shown to prevent hospitalization or death broadly. And she hammers on vitamin D deficiency, says 75% of her patients, 74% of the U.S. population, are deficient. Pushes for awareness of sun exposure benefits, things often overlooked in conventional advice. It all fits her theme of questioning norms.
So, pulling it all together, what's the main takeaway from Dr. Bowden's story as a case study? I think her experience serves as a really critical, if deeply troubling example of how institutional forces, financial, political, bureaucratic, can clash with and potentially override individual clinical judgment, especially during a crisis. It highlights the immense pressures that can be brought to bear on independent practitioners who deviate from the established line, regardless of their reasoning or even patient outcomes.
And the consequences of that conflict.
The most significant consequence, arguably, is that deep, maybe even permanent, erosion of public trust in the medical establishment we talked about. When people see doctors attacked for their judgment, when they feel their own injuries are denied, when they perceive financial interest driving policy, that foundational trust breaks down. And rebuilding it is incredibly difficult.
Which leaves us with a big question.
A critical one for everyone listening. What are the lasting consequences when independent clinical judgment gets overridden like this during a crisis? How does this erosion of trust reshape the future of healthcare, our relationship with doctors, our willingness to trust institutions next time? And maybe just as importantly, how do we create a system that can tolerate dissent, value independent observation, and prioritize patient well-being above all else even, or perhaps especially when the pressure is greatest?
A lot to think about indeed. A complex case with no easy answers. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.